Good morning, viewers. This is Dr. Aijaz Qureshi from Toronto, Canada, with today's the Daydreamers Show. Today we have a very interesting topic that everybody loves to talk about, and everybody has an eye on it. We're going to talk about the U.S. policy about Israel and Palestine. So, what is the U.S. doing in terms of the peace talks and things like that? So today we have a very esteemed guest with us. His name is Dr. Stephen Zunes. He's a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco. He is also a coordinator of the program in Middle Eastern Studies. And he has been recognized as one of the country's leading scholars in the U.S. and Middle East policy and of strategic motivation action. So what is happening on that front? Professor Zunes he is also serving as a senior policy analyst for foreign policy in Focus Project of the Institute of Policy Studies. He is also associate editor of the Peace Review. He is also a contributing editor of Tikkun, if I pronounce it right. Please forgive me if I have pronounced it wrong. And he is originally from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Right now, he's living in the West Coast in San Francisco. So we welcome to the show Professor Zunes.
Good to be with you.
Thank you so much. So let's start the show. The very first question to you is the President Truman, the U.S. president, in 1945, he originally crafted a policy about the Middle East. So what were the initial contents? Because at that time in 1945, the Israel did not exist. Mm-hmm. And so what was included in that policy? So what was it all about?
Oh, the international community and the newly formed United Nations was faced with the dilemma of how both Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews in the then British Mandate of Palestine were demanding a state of their own. The United States sided with the Zionists, the Jewish nationalists, who wanted to form a state of Israel. And despite some concerns by many people around the world, particularly in the global South, but also among some top analysts in the State Department and who were concerned about the instability and the reaction to the creation of a Jewish state of Israel in the heart of the Arab world, just as these nations were emerging from colonialism. There are a number of reasons for this. I mean, there was there are many as the horrors of the Holocaust had become apparent. There were some liberal elements in the United States that believed the Jews should be able to have a state of their own, but unfortunately ignoring the fact that people were already living there, Palestinian Arabs who'd been there for many centuries. And but there's also a motivation that many American Jews were really pushing for this idea of U.S. support for Israel, and Harry Truman, being the consummate politician, was sensitive to the political side of it. But frankly, I think the primary motivation, similar to that of France and Britain and other countries that were supporting the establishment of Israel, was the establishment of a pro-Western foothold in the Middle East. At that time, almost all the Jews who had migrated to Israel were of European background, and their sympathies and loyalties were more with Western countries and their interests than they were with their fellow Middle Easterners. And so it was, in many ways, I believe it was primarily a strategic decision to have a pro-Western allied government to counter the growing sense of nationalism that was emerging in the Arab world at this time.
Great. So in 1948, when after the Israel's existence came into existence, there was a council, policy council created that was known as Middle East Policy Council in 1948. Does that council still exist, or it vanished?
Well, I mean, the State Department has a number of regional divisions that have evolved over the years, sometimes with different names. There was not much in the State Department at that time about the Global South because much of the world was still under Western colonialism. I mean, there wasn't even an Africa desk in the State Department until the late 1950s, for example. But the Middle East Council was part of a broader effort to advance U.S. interests in the Middle East. It had is more than just Israel, of course. They were very interested in solidifying relationships with the oil producing countries, for example. By this time, oil was seen as vital for Western economic development. There was that famous meeting with President Roosevelt and King Saud, where basically the United States promised to keep the regime in power in return for access to oil. Indeed, Eisenhower himself said that the Middle East was the most important strategic prize in the world, and with the growing Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union, though obviously there was a lot of attention on the division of Europe, and of course the Chinese Communist Revolution, Korea, all these kinds of things. So you had Europe and East Asia in many ways mostly on people's minds. Even back then, they recognized the important strategic significance of the Middle East, and a belief that Israel could be a supporter of U.S. interests.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing the thought. So, talking about you talked about the African desk in the United Nations and in the U.S. Senate. The previous regime before the Trump regime was Obama, and in that regime, we talked about. I mean, everybody knows that the peace talk agenda should be on top because that's the place where the most unrest is, and we have to talk about the borders and the landscape around and the security and in Jerusalem and all those kind of things. They should be on the top priority to bring peace to that area of the world. So what happened in the previous regime? Obama talked about it, but I didn't see really happening any serious actions taken around the peace talk.
Well, Obama's outlined the U.S. position in a way that was actually fairly reasonable, at least in rhetoric. I mean, he talked about a viable, contiguous Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, with some minor reciprocal border adjustments. He acknowledged that the Palestinian ties to and the importance of Arab East Jerusalem. And security guarantees for both peoples. I mean, it was in many ways it was along the lines of the longstanding international consensus. He was attacked by not just Republicans but many hawkish Democrats for that position. But unfortunately, like a lot of Obama's initiatives, where the intentions may have been good, he did very little to follow through. He still kept this idea that both sides have to work it out among themselves. Yeah. And of course, while the Palestine Authority, Fatah, the PLO, under the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas, largely had agreed to this outline of that Obama and then later Secretary of State John Kerry put forward, the right-wing government Israel rejected it, and yet the United States refused to put any pressure on Israel. Refused to allow the United Nations Security Council to enforce its resolutions. Refused to consider cutting aid or other pressures for Israel to make the necessary compromises for peace. So it really didn't get very far. And in addition, the Obama administration added a new demand that no previous administration had, that not only did the Palestinians have to recognize Israel and provide security guarantees, which they already had, but they needed to specifically recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Now, this is new. I mean, Egypt wasn't required to do that in their peace treaty with Israel in 1978. Jordan was not required to do that in their peace treaty with Israel in 1994. And for obvious political reasons, given that 20% of Israel's population is ethnically Palestinian, for other reasons, this was not something that the Palestinians could do, even the most moderate Palestinians. I mean, as the boss put it, Israel can call itself anything it wants, but the Palestinians should not be required to declare Israel as a Jewish state. I mean, when you look at other treaties, I mean, the United States never recognized the Soviet Union as a communist state in the various arms control agreements and other treaties. Again, this is unprecedented in history that a country has been demanded to officially acknowledge the ethnic or religious identity of another country as part of a peace agreement. So, in many ways, this seemed to be designed to make it look like that, in the words of Kerry and Obama, both sides refused to compromise, when in fact the Palestinians had compromised in everything except this new demand, unprecedented demand, whereas the Israelis rejected most of the cornerstone of the longstanding international consensus for Israeli-Palestinian peace that the Obama administration was putting forward.
Right. So, excuse me. So in 1948, right after, less than a month after the declaration of the Israel, there was a Near Eastern affair mediator was appointed in the United States. Does that position still exist, or it doesn't exist anymore?
Well, the United Nations sent in a special representative, or Bernadotte, who's a Swede, who was assassinated by a right-wing Zionist terrorist. He was placed by an American political scientist who tried to negotiate to bring the sides together, and as far that only Ralph Bunche was his name, but he went and Bunche won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, but it basically led to the recognition of the ceasefire lines after the fighting between 1947 and 49. Didn't really do much to establish peace. Now, the more recent administrations have appointed, U.S. administrations have appointed, various special envoys to try to negotiate the peace process. For example, George Mitchell was initially appointed by President Obama in that role. Ironically, Trump has appointed his son-in-law, who is a far right-wing Zionist and supporter of the settlers and Netanyahu, to that position. The United Nations has sometimes had somebody in such a role. Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, had that position for a time. But basically, the United States has insisted that the UN should have virtually no role. And here's the whole irony of the whole thing, is that the I think one could sum up, in fact, why the peace process has failed as this: the United States has been playing the contradictory role of the chief mediator in the conflict, in fact, insisting that we should be the only mediator in the conflict. Both Democratic and Republican administrations with broad bipartisan support in Congress have made clear that the United States alone, should be the arbiter here. That's certainly the position of the Israeli government as well. And yet, at the same time, the United States is the number one military, economic, and diplomatic supporter of one of the two parties, that is Israel, and which, of course, is by far the most powerful of the two parties. Now, anybody who studied anything about mediation, negotiation, conflict resolution, anything like that, know that you cannot, that a mediator has to be objective. They have to be balanced. And for the United States to, and it's impossible to see how you could have a peace agreement if the sole mediator of the conflict is also the primary supporter of the more powerful of the two parties.
Great. So viewers, you're commenting. Thank you so much for your comments. Just a disclaimer, this show is totally, completely for education purposes only, and there is no affiliation with any sort of political or any other organization or association or government or anything. This is just for education purposes only. This is just a talk show. We are talking about the topic, that is, what is the U.S. policy around Israel and Palestine relationship. Your comments are welcome. Thank you so much. You're asking questions. We'll bring those questions, but let me finish talking to Dr. Zunes first, so that we get through what we want to talk about, and then if we have some time left on Dr. Zunes' plate, we're going to bring your questions up. And again, those questions are your individual perspective. I or Dr. Zunes may not necessarily agree with your thoughts. So thank you so much for watching us. And Dr. Zunes, Professor Zunes' introduction was made in the beginning. For people who don't know Professor Zunes, please revisit the show or look at the post. I have added his introduction in the post as well. So thank you so much for being with us, and you're watching the Daydreamers Show. All right. So Professor Zunes, so what is happening right now?
Basically, the difference we have with the Trump administration is that they pretty much dispense with any notion of balance or objectivity. Right. As I implied earlier, this idea that we're an honest broker was dubious from the beginning. But here, Trump has and all his key appointments on Israel-Palestine have been from the far right. We're talking about an ambassador, for example, who believes there should be no Palestinian state, even a mini state, that Israel essentially has the right of conquest of all the occupied territory. He's been a big supporter and funder of these illegal settlements. Israel, as most of your listeners probably know, has been colonizing Palestinian territory seized in the 1967 war. It's transferring civilian populations onto territory seized by military force is a direct violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Its application to the Israeli-occupied territories has been confirmed in no less than five UN Security Council resolutions, as well as a landmark decision of the International Court of Justice. And yet, the U.S. policy is that these settlements are fine. They can even expand them. I mean, at least the Obama administration criticized the expansion, but the Trump administration believes Israel has the right to do this. And the other appointments I mentioned, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, as well as another appointment whose name temporarily escapes me, who's the who also is a key in the negotiation aspects, are all supporters of the Israeli far right and the settlement movement. And so, basically, with the cutoff of funding for humanitarian aid for the Palestinians, along with other policy statements, for example, the United States was virtually alone in the world in defending the massacre of hundreds of unarmed protesters in Gaza, by Israeli troops. The moving the embassy to Jerusalem, making the United States the first country to make that shift. That Jerusalem, a multi-ethnic and multi-religious city, essentially saying it belongs to Israeli Jews alone. Of course, it was highly provocative, and it in many ways, I think this does mark a strong shift to the right in U.S. policy, but again, I'd emphasize that even under more moderate administrations, like Obama, the peace process was going nowhere because of the refusal to push Israel to make the necessary compromises for peace. Because indeed, even if one works on the assumption that both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have a right to statehood and security and the like, the onus for compromise belongs to the occupying power. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, we didn't say, "Oh, the two sides need to work it out among themselves." I mean, it's or the U.S. policy isn't, "Oh, the Crimeans and the Russians should figure it out among themselves," or Indonesia and East Timor, they need to work it out among themselves. No, occupation is an occupation, and that foreign belligerent occupations such as this are not things that strictly bilateral negotiations without any pressure can resolve, because obviously the occupying power holds the cards, and that's why we have international law. That's why we have the United Nations. But the United States has blocked the UN from taking any kind of leadership or any kind of role in pushing Israel to make the necessary compromises for peace.
Right. So do you think, now you have a very close eye on the Middle Eastern relationship and policies and things like that. Do you think that Jerry Kushner is on the right path, and we will see some fruitful results out of this?
No, I can't imagine that he would come up with any kind of proposal that would be at all acceptable to the Palestinians or at all reasonable, within the
time,
the norms of international law.
Yeah.
The United Nations Charter is quite clear that it is illegitimate for any country to expand its territory by force. I mean, that's what World War II was fought about. That's what the United Nations was founded on.
Right.
And it's pretty clear that any proposal by Kushner would at most give the Palestinians a series of non-contiguous cantons effectively surrounded by Israel and with some degree of limited self-governance. I mean, that is not a viable state, and that would not be at all acceptable.
Great. So we are on the dot now, 30 minutes of the show. We have lots of comments. There are about 26 comments in here. Do we have time, Professor Zunes?
I'd be happy to spend more time. I just realized I need to plug in my computer, or it's going to die on me. But I can do that as we talk. So please go ahead, and you can read the.
I'll read the questions.
You can please go ahead and read the questions.
Now, as I said, I may not necessarily agree with the questions or comments coming in, but I'll. This is the format of the show. I'm going to read out the comments. And so Waleed Ahmed is saying, let me bring the comment up on the screen here. And Walid Ahmad Khan is our regular viewer. He's saying British so-called strategic decisions in shape of Kashmir and Israel has caused triple times more bloodshed than Holocaust. Okay, that's I don't think it's a question. It's an opinion. Then Walid Ahmad Khan is again saying a Middle Eastern conflict and South Asian conflicts were seed investments by British for future destabilization in the regions that had potential to grow economically. Okay, that's an opinion again. So thank you so much. Wakar Reis is saying good topic and discussion. Thank you so much. So this is an interesting question. It is a question now. It's saying, Walid Ahmad Khan is saying, where is Palestine on the map now? Is it just Gaza? Is the Palestine?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the geographic region we think of as Palestine would include what's now the modern state of Israel, the West Bank, which includes East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. In terms of control, the Palestinian Authority, which is the officially recognized government of Palestine, controls most of the urban areas in the West Bank, along with some of the some other more rural areas. Though Israel, in effect, controls most of the land there. The Gaza Strip, it was seized by Hamas, an Islamist Palestinian faction, and about a dozen years ago, they have they're essentially under siege by the Israelis with the support of the Egyptians, and of course you have that horrific humanitarian crisis that is there. I mean, the official position of the Palestine authorities are willing to accept a state in the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, with some minor reciprocal border adjustments. That would be only 22% of historic Palestine. So, the Palestinians have already compromised incredibly, saying that Israel can essentially have 78% of their historic homeland. But the position of Israel and the United States is, no, that's too much. The Palestinians need to compromise more, have even less than 22%, and that's not going to go anywhere. And indeed, if you look at how Israeli settlements have just proliferated throughout the West Bank, dividing with hundreds of checkpoints of Israeli troops. I mean, it's getting hard to imagine at this point how there could be a contiguous, viable Palestinian state, even on the 22% model, which is why many people, and I'm starting to be that way myself, who have fought for a two-state solution for decades, are now beginning to think maybe it's too late. Maybe we need to start thinking of some kind of single binational state, where both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs would have, guarantees of their rights and have their own institutions and all, but be a single country. Of course, that's, given that Israel is unwilling to give up 22% of Palestine, it's going to be hard to imagine that they would be willing to compromise to this extent. But in many ways, we may have to shift at some point from an anti-occupation struggle to what is essentially an anti-apartheid struggle. That does stress, the idea for equal rights for everyone, regardless of religion or ethnicity, for the entire area, including what's officially recognized as Israel, as well as the West Bank and Gaza Strip.
Great. Thank you so much for the answer. We have another question. Walid Khan is asking, what are your thoughts on the Israel's nuclear program?
Well, of course, Israel has had atomic weapons since at least the early 1970s. It's ironic that the United States invaded Iraq on the grounds they allegedly had a nuclear program, which they at that point did not, and that we threatened war on Iran, and because of their nuclear program, even though the treaty, it makes it physically impossible for them to develop nuclear weapons. This obsession, with governments we don't like having nuclear weapons, while the United States has been fine about Israel having an arsenal of at least 200 or 300 nuclear bombs. Indeed, the United States, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, has blocked calls for a conference on a nuclear weapons-free zone for the entire Middle East. Nuclear weapons-free zones already exist for Latin America, Antarctica, Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, the South Pacific. I mean, this is not just some kind of idealistic thing. This is something that most of the world is under nuclear weapons-free zones now. Why not the Middle East as well?
That's right.
But that would include having to force Israel to disarm, which the United States, isn't willing to accept. It's yet another example of the double standards the United States seems to have when it comes to its strategic allies like Israel.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, thank you so much for taking that tough question. I know it was a tough question. But that's the fairness of the show, that we really respect the comments coming in, and we abide by our standards of responding back to those kind of questions. We have another question. Dr. Stephen Zunes, please do elaborate on Israel's war in Middle Eastern, which has destabilized entire region. I think this has been talked about. So let's.
Yeah. Except I would emphasize that while Israel has a lot to be accounted for in terms of their the occupation, repression, ethnic cleansing, and other oppression of the Palestinians, their wars on Lebanon and Gaza, which have killed many thousands of innocent civilians. That there are plenty of other issues in the Middle East that Israel is not responsible for. I mean, there are some people who say that Israel is somehow behind the war in Syria. That's not true. There are a lot of parties to blame for the horror in Syria. Israel is at most a very, very minor player in that. Similarly, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was not because of Israeli pressure. The United States had its own distorted imperialist interest in launching that war. So, while again Israel should be held accountable for its many crimes, I would caution people to exaggerate Israel's responsibility for some of the broader conflicts and issues affecting the Middle East.
Right. Fawad Khalid is our viewer, another viewer. He's saying that Israel is the only country in the Middle East which is prospering. Do you think that it will no longer be needing the U.S. support in future? Do you think that situation will arise?
I mean,
will never need U.S. support?
I mean, a lot of people have pointed out the fact that Israel, even though it's only 1/1000th of the world's population and is one of the, generally one of the 2 or 3 dozen most affluent countries in the world per capita, receives as much as 1/3 of all U.S. foreign aid. However, if you look at this foreign aid, 80%, it's almost all military aid, and 80% of that aid is essentially goes to U.S. arms manufacturers to provide Israel with weapons. In other words, it doesn't go directly to Israel. It goes to these wealthy defense industries here in the United States.
Right.
And I've actually talked to some Israeli generals and top officials, and they say that, a lot of the stuff they receive, they don't even need. That so-called U.S. aid to Israel is more a matter of keeping the assembly lines running at McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed Martin, and so it is not like we are. This is not charity. This is not helping the poor Israelis or anything like that. This is helping powerful corporations here in the U.S. Similarly, back when the United States did provide Israel with economic aid, direct aid, it came out to almost exactly what Israel owed U.S. banks in terms of interest on on previous loans for, again, U.S. military equipment. So it's this is so again. I would say U.S. aid for Israel is more about U.S. subsidies for powerful corporations than it is actually any kind of, giving to charity to Israelis.
Right. So I have another question of mine. Do you think there is a need to disband the arms and weapons manufacturers actually?
President Eisenhower, way back in 1960, warned of this, what do you call the military-industrial complex. And I mean, I think it's rather revealing. I remember back in 1994, 76 out of 100 U.S. senators, both Republicans and Democrats, wrote a letter to President Clinton saying that despite this is right after the Oslo Accords were signed, there's real hope for Israeli-Palestinian peace. They said, despite all this progress, we should we should increase military aid to Israel. And the only reason they gave in that 2-page letter was the large-scale procurement of arms by in the previous couple of years by Arab countries. But what the letter didn't mention was that 70% of these arms to the Arab countries also came from the United States.
There you go.
And it's interesting because after the Gulf War in 1991, there were serious proposals in the international community for an arms moratorium on the Middle East, and Israel accepted it. And they had good reason to, because Israel was not only the most powerful country already militarily, but it's the only country that had an advanced arms industry itself. And yet the United States rejected it. So, because we wanted to keep on selling arms to these oil-rich Arab countries. And so, if our concern was really Israel's security, we would have agreed with them. Let's have an arms moratorium, because that would have, given Israel a good advantage. But We're not really in Israel's security. We're interested in profiting the American arms industry. So we get to not only send all these subsidize these arms going to Israel, but to make bring in hundreds of billions of additional money by selling arms to these various Arab dictatorships.
Yeah, exactly. So do you think U.S. economy can grow otherwise?
Certainly. I mean, actually, military spending is the least efficient of all government spending. Exactly. Because it's very capital intensive. I mean, for every $1 billion or $1 million or however much you want to compare, you could if you put it into education, if you put it into housing, if you put it into renewable energy, you would create a lot more jobs.
That's right.
And it would have an ancillary effect, which would help the whole economy. High military spending is a disaster. It profits some very powerful companies. But in terms of the overall economy, it's a terrible way. It's a terrible waste. I mean, even putting aside the people who get killed by the weapons, it is a horrible waste just on strictly economic terms.
That's right. I would share a comment, and it really touched my heart. And I've been disturbed mentally for quite some time now. I've seen a video on Facebook now. With the social media, people have phones and they capture and they upload the videos. And so I've seen a video where a girl was on the gunpoint, and she was asked to empty her backpack. So she emptied her backpack, and there was nothing. There was books and other stuff. There was no weapon. There was nothing. There was no bomb or anything. And still, she was shot dead. Mm-hmm. That was really very disturbing. Right in front of, there were hundreds of people around, and so it was really, really disturbing. So I wish this kind of thing can end, and there is a need for peace in that region. Definitely, these two nations can live peacefully, and that's my hope and that's my prayer. That Israelis and Palestinians get settled and peace be upon them, both of them actually, and there should be peace in the area. And I wish that U.S. can create a policy to really disband the arms and weapons manufacturers and things like that, because that is creating a mess, actually. And spend that money or make that money in other areas, as you mentioned. So we have lots of other comments and questions. I don't think we have enough time left on the show to talk about those. So thank you so much, viewers, for your comments, and I really appreciate your time. You have been with us. Dr. Zunes, Professor Zunes, sorry, we have to end the show here. So I personally thank you for your time and your opinion and your efforts in creating and crafting policies around Middle East peace and things like that. So thank you so much once again.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So towards the end, how would you like to conclude this show? What is your message to our viewers?
Okay. I think it's there's been a tendency, I think, to blame U.S. policy primarily or almost exclusively on powerful Jewish interests in the United States, and I would caution against that. I would say certainly you have groups like AIPAC, that can, pressure some members of Congress on this, that, and the other. But the fact is that the United States has never been very supportive of the right of self-determination. When we support Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara, we support Indonesia's we supported Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. We supported South Africa's occupation of Namibia. I mean, we've long supported occupiers. We've long tried to undermine the United Nations international law to advance our interests. There's I think the policy of the U.S. towards Israel and Palestine should be seen in the broader context of the U.S. role in the world. And so in a sense, because this idea that some people put forward, if it weren't for the pro-Israel lobby, the U.S. would have a policy in the Middle East that was less militaristic and more pro-human rights and pro-international law. But let's be honest, when has the United States had that kind of policy anywhere? And so I think there are certain unique aspects to Israel, Palestine, both the issue itself and in the domestic politics behind it that it shouldn't be discounted. But I think it's important to not fall into this kind of exceptionalism and to see United States and Israel, within the broader context of U.S. imperialism, the U.S. role in the world, and the unfortunate long history of distorted views of what constitutes U.S. interests. Because ultimately, U.S. policy is not just bad for the Palestinians, but it's bad for Israel and the United States as well. And because as long as there's no peace, as long as there's no justice, there's no peace. As long as no peace, everybody's security is threatened.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the final message. I really appreciate it. Viewers, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to Professor Zunes today. And Professor Zunes is the Political and International Studies Professor at the University of San Francisco. And he's a close eye on the Middle East relationship between U.S. and the Middle East. So thank you so much, viewers, and thank you so much, Professor Zunes, for your time.
Thanks again.
All right. Take care of yourself and people around you.
Thank you. You too.